The white snake. There was once a great stone residence that stood at the edge of a kingdom whose name has been forgotten by time. Its walls were thick and cold, built from quarried rock that had seen centuries pass without yielding to weather or war. Within those walls lived a ruler, neither king nor lord in the way we might imagine, but a figure of authority whose word carried weight in matters of land and law. This ruler kept strange customs, though few knew of them. Chief among these was the manner of his evening meals. Each night, as the sun withdrew its light from the world and shadows pooled in the corners of the great hall, he would sit alone at a long table carved from a single massive tree. The hall was vast enough to host hundreds, yet it remained empty save for him. No guards stood at attention. No advisors whispered counsel. No servants bustled about with platters and pitchers. The ruler ate in absolute silence, served only by the presence of a single covered dish that appeared before him, as if by arrangement with invisible hands. The dish itself was remarkable. Fashioned from silver so pure, it seemed to hold its own light, even in the dimness of evening. It sat upon the table without ceremony, its domed lid concealing whatever lay beneath. And each night, the ruler would eat alone, lifting the lid himself, consuming what was inside, and replacing the cover before departing. No one saw what he ate. No one dared to ask. It was simply understood that this was how things were done. And in matters concerning rulers, understanding often matters less than obedience. But someone did bring that dish to the table each night. Someone had to carry it from wherever it was prepared, through the cold stone corridors, into the silent hall. That someone was a young attendant, a figure so thoroughly unremarkable that most people's eyes slid past him without recognition. He was neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor plain in any way that would lodge in memory. His movements were efficient but not notable. His face carried no distinctive marks. He performed his duties with the kind of quiet competence that makes a person functionally invisible, useful but unseen, necessary but unnoticed. This was the manner of his existence. He would receive the covered dish from hands he never quite saw, carry it through passages lit by torches that cast more shadow than illumination, place it carefully before the ruler's empty chair, and then withdraw to wait in an alcove until the meal was finished. Then he would return, collect the dish, always covered again, always seemingly untouched, and carry it back through those same dim corridors to return it to wherever such things went. He had done this for years. It had become the rhythm of his evenings, as predictable as the movement of stars across the night sky. He had never once looked beneath the lid, not because he was incurious. No human being is entirely without curiosity, but because the boundary between servant and master was drawn in lines as clear and uncrossable as the walls themselves. To look would be to step across that line, and those who stepped across such lines in the houses of the powerful rarely found their footing again. But on one particular evening, as autumn was beginning its slow work of pulling color from the world, something shifted in the ordinary pattern of things. The attendant carried the silver dish as always, placed it on the table as always, and withdrew to his alcove as always. He waited for the ruler to arrive, for the ritual to continue its predictable course. But this night, the ruler did not come. Minutes accumulated into a quarter, hour, then half. The torch in the hallway burned lower. Still no footsteps echoed through the stone passages. Still the great hall remained empty except for the attendant in his alcove and the covered dish gleaming softly in the dimness. The young man stood very still, listening. The silence in that place was not merely the absence of sound, but something more substantial, as if the air itself had weight. He could hear his own breathing, steady and shallow. He could hear the subtle crackle of the torch consuming itself. And beneath those sounds, or perhaps woven through them, he became aware of a quality of attention. The sense that the moment was watching itself, waiting for what would happen next. His feet moved before his mind gave permission. 3 steps brought him from the alcove to the table. His hands, which had carried the dish 1,000 times without trembling, trembled now as they reached toward the silver lid. There was no one to see, no one to know. And yet the act of reaching felt enormous, as if he were reaching not toward a covered dish, but toward a threshold beyond which his life would become something different from what it had been. He lifted the lid, not entirely, just enough to see, just enough to know. The silver made a small sound as it moved, a whisper of metal against metal. And then the interior was revealed. Inside, coiled in a manner that suggested both rest and readiness, lay a white serpent. Not a living creature. This much was immediately clear. But neither was it quite dead in the way that cooked things are dead. Its flesh was pale as milk, pale as new snow, pale as the inner bark of certain trees that grow where little light reaches. It had been prepared with care, though what kind of preparation left no visible marks or evidence of fire. It simply lay there, complete and somehow perfect, as if it had always been exactly this, and could never have been anything else. The attendant stared. His hand still held the lid, suspended in the air. His breathing had stopped without him noticing. The serpent, if it could still be called a serpent now that it had been transformed into food, exuded no smell. It gave off no steam. It presented itself to his vision as a fact, simple and inexplicable. He should have replaced the lid immediately. He knew this. The knowledge sat clear and bright in his mind, even as his hand moved toward the dish again. This time not to cover but to touch. His fingers made contact with the white flesh. It was cool but not cold, smooth but not slippery. The texture was unlike anything he had encountered before. Not quite like fish, not quite like fowl, not quite like any animal that walks or crawls. And then, in a moment he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He brought a small piece of that white flesh to his mouth and tasted it. The flavor was difficult to describe afterward, when he tried to put it into words, even to himself. It was pale, yes. That word seemed to apply to taste as well as color. It was metallic but not unpleasant, like rainwater caught in a stone basin. It was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, a coldness that came from somewhere deep and old, from places beneath the world where heat had never reached. The flesh dissolved on his tongue almost immediately, leaving behind a sensation rather than a substance, a change rather than a residue. He swallowed. The room around him appeared exactly as it had before. The same stone walls, the same dim torchlight, the same empty table and silent hall. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed. And yet the world had shifted in a way so fundamental that even standing still required him to find his balance again. He replaced the lid carefully, his hands moving through the familiar gesture with precision. But his mind was elsewhere, trying to track the change that was spreading through him like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped into still water. It was not pain. It was not pleasure. It was alteration, pure and complete. As if some door in his perception had been opened that could never quite close again. He waited in his alcove, and after what seemed both an eternity and no time at all, the ruler finally arrived and ate his meal in the usual silence. The attendant collected the dish afterward, still covered, still apparently untouched, and carried it back through the corridors. But now those corridors felt different. The shadows held texture. The stones seemed to breathe with a rhythm slower than human lungs could manage. Everything was itself, but also more than itself, alive with significance he had never noticed before. He stepped out of the residence into the night air, beginning his walk home through streets that had become as familiar as his own hands. The moon hung overhead, neither full nor dark, but somewhere in between, offering just enough light to mark the distinction between road and building, between earth and sky. He walked as he always walked, his feet finding their way without requiring thought. But as he moved through the darkness, he began to hear things. At first, he dismissed it as the ordinary sounds of night, the rustle of wind through leaves, the distant call of some nocturnal bird, the small movements of creatures going about their invisible business. But gradually, He realized that what he was hearing was not merely sound, but meaning. The rustling resolved itself into words, or something adjacent to words, communications that carried intent and information as clearly as human speech, though shaped differently. Two sparrows huddled on a rooftop were discussing territory. Their voices came to him sharp and clear, full of boundary negotiations and warnings about rival flocks that had been encroaching from the eastern gardens. Below them, in the shadows near a merchant's stoop, rats held what could only be called a council, debating the best routes to the granary, now that the baker's cat had grown more vigilant. An ant column, moving along the base of a wall, hummed with coordinated purpose, not individual voices, but a collective intelligence determining the most efficient path to a source of spilled honey near the fountain. The young man stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the empty street, surrounded by voices emerging from the darkness like stars appearing as night deepens. They came from everywhere, from the soil beneath his feet where earthworms negotiated their slow journeys, from the wooden beams of buildings where beetles chronicled the long work of transformation, from the air itself where moths traced patterns that meant something to those who could read them. He listened, not with effort, but with the same natural attention one might give to a friend speaking across a table. And as he listened, he understood that these were not new sounds. They had always been present, always been speaking, always been filling the world with communication and intention. Only now could he hear them. Only now could he understand. The white serpent's flesh had not created these voices, but had opened his ears to them, had tuned his perception to a frequency that had been broadcasting continuously since long before humans had learned to shape words with their own tongues. He began walking again, slowly, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was hearing. The insects were not speaking to him. They barely registered his presence. But he could understand them nonetheless, could follow the logic of their concerns and the patterns of their thoughts. They were ancient witnesses to the world, seeing and knowing things that human attention passed over or never noticed at all. A beetle crawling along a fence spoke of moisture patterns in the wood. A spider suspended in her web vibrated messages about approaching weather. A cricket somewhere in a garden rehearsed a song that carried information about temperature and season, about the slow wheel of the year turning toward winter. He reached his small dwelling, a room in a building where others like him lived, servants and laborers and people who occupied the spaces between significance and anonymity. But he did not sleep. He sat at the narrow window and listened to the night speaking to itself, learning the texture of a world that had always been there, but which he had never quite inhabited until now. Days passed. He continued his duties as before, carrying the silver dish, serving in silence, moving through the residence with the same unremarkable efficiency. But everything had changed. He walked through a world that was constantly speaking, constantly revealing itself, constantly offering knowledge to anyone who could hear. He learned things about the household that no one else knew. Where the mice nested in the walls, where the birds preferred to roost, where moisture was weakening the mortar between stones. None of it seemed particularly important until suddenly it was. One morning, the residents erupted in accusation. A treasured object had vanished from the ruler's private chambers, a ring, old and valuable, significant not so much for its material worth, but for its history and the authority it represented. The ruler demanded answers. The household was thrown into confusion and fear. Suspicion, as it always does in such situations, fell upon those who had access but no power to defend themselves. The young attendant was summoned. Not gently, not with questions, but with certainty already formed. He had been in the corridors. He had been near the chambers. He was convenient and available, and, most importantly, unable to call upon influence or position to deflect blame. In the logic of powerful households, this made him guilty before any evidence was examined. He stood before those who questioned him. Not the ruler himself, but officials who served as extensions of the ruler's will. They asked where he had been, what he had seen, why they should not conclude that he had taken what was missing. Their questions came rapid and pointed, designed not to uncover truth, but to confirm a conclusion already reached. The attendant answered truthfully, but his truth was thin and unpersuasive. He had been in the corridors, yes. He had passed near the chambers, yes. But he had taken nothing. He had seen nothing. His words fell into the room like stones into deep water, making barely a ripple before disappearing. He was confined to a small room while they decided what to do with him. It was not quite a cell. There were no bars, no locks, but the expectations were clear. He was to remain there until judgment was rendered. Given the usual pace of such things, that judgment would likely come swiftly and carry consequences he did not want to contemplate. He sat in the small room as afternoon light crept across the floor and began its retreat. And as he sat, he listened. Not to the voices of officials or guards, not to human speech at all, but to the smaller voices that filled the spaces humans didn't notice. He listened to the mice in the walls. He listened to the birds on the roof. He listened to the spiders in the corners, and the beetles in the floorboards, and the ants tracing their invisible roads through the cracks in the stone. And from those voices, a story emerged. The mice had seen everything. They always did. They lived in the spaces between human attention, witnesses to the private moments and unguarded actions that happened when people thought they were alone. They had seen the ruler's own steward, a man of trusted position and long service, enter the private chambers earlier that morning. They had seen him take the ring, moving with the confidence of someone who believed his actions would never be questioned. They had seen him conceal it in his own quarters, hidden among his belongings, where no one would think to look, because no one would suspect him. The attendant listened to this account with careful attention, noting details: which wall the mice had been in, what time the morning light had been slanting through which window, where exactly the steward had placed the ring. The mice were precise in their observations, their memories sharp in the way of creatures whose survival depends on noticing everything. When the officials returned to question him again, he told them what he knew, not how he knew it. That would have been impossible to explain, but simply what was true. Check the steward's quarters, he said. Check among his belongings. You will find what you're looking for there. The officials responded with skepticism that bordered on mockery. The steward had been with the household for decades. He was beyond suspicion. The accusation was clearly an attempt at deflection, the desperate gambit of someone caught in wrongdoing. But the attendant spoke with such quiet certainty, such specific detail, that eventually someone decided it would be simpler to prove him wrong than to dismiss him without investigation. They searched the steward's quarters, and there, exactly where the mice had said it would be, they found the ring. The reversal was immediate and absolute. The steward was seized. The attendant was released. Apologies were offered, though they were brief and perfunctory. The kind of apologies powerful institutions give when forced to acknowledge error, but not quite willing to fully admit fault. Questions were asked about how the attendant had known, but he provided only vague responses about having seen something or heard something. At some point, and eventually the questions ceased because the matter was resolved, and there were other concerns demanding attention. But the attendant understood something the officials did not. He had just revealed himself as different. He had demonstrated knowledge that came from no ordinary source. In a household built on hierarchies of information and power, this made him dangerous in a new way, not threatening, perhaps, but unsettling. People who knew things they shouldn't know made others uncomfortable, made them wonder what else was being observed, what other secrets might be revealed. That evening, after performing his usual duties, the young man did not return to his dwelling. Instead, he gathered the few possessions that mattered to him, which were so few they fit easily in a cloth sack, and left the residence. not in haste, not with any sense of fleeing, but with the recognize yourself, but with the deliberate pace of someone who has understood that his place in one pattern has ended, and it is time to find his place in another. He walked through the city as night fell, listening to the voices that now formed the constant backdrop of his existence. They did not guide him, they simply were, speaking their truths and concerns and observations as they always had. But he had learned enough to understand that knowledge changes where one belongs. He had heard what others could not hear, had learned what others did not know, and in doing so had stepped outside the boundaries that had previously defined his life. The city gates stood open, as they always did until full dark. He passed through them without ceremony, joining the handful of other travelers and merchants, making their way into the open country beyond the walls. The road stretched ahead, pale in the moonlight, leading toward other places, other kingdoms, other possibilities. He did not know where he was going. He knew only that he was going, and that seemed sufficient for now. The road taught him things, not lessons in the way a teacher might impart wisdom, but in the way the world teaches, through the simple act of moving through it. He walked for days, and then for weeks, and the walking itself became a kind of meditation, a rhythm that allowed his mind to settle into the new shape his perception had taken. He helped where he could, in small ways that cost him little, but mattered greatly to those he helped. On the third day of walking, he came upon a bird caught in a tangle of discarded fishing line. Its wing bent at an angle that spoke of pain and impending death. He heard its distress, not metaphorically, but actually heard it. The bird's voice sharp with panic and resignation. He stopped and spent the better part of an hour carefully unwinding the line, his fingers working with patience to free each trapped feather, each bent joint. When the bird finally pulled free and took flight, it said nothing to him. Birds do not thank in the way humans do, but he felt the rightness of the action settle into his bones. A week later, he encountered a snake on the road, basking in the afternoon sun, directly in the path of an approaching merchant's cart. The snake was old, slow, digesting some recent meal and unable to move quickly. The attendant heard its lazy contentment, its complete unawareness of the danger bearing down upon it. He stepped forward and used a long stick to gently encourage the snake to move aside, guiding it into the grass at the road's edge. The merchant's cart rumbled past moments later, its wheels passing over the spot where the snake had been. The snake said nothing. Snakes are not given to conversation, but it regarded him with its ancient eyes for a moment before sliding away into the undergrowth. These were small kindnesses, the sort that happen countless times in countless ways when someone chooses to pay attention to the world around them. But they accumulated like drops of water filling a vessel, each one small, but together forming something substantial. The attendant did not think of them as debts owed or favors granted. He simply acted as seemed appropriate in the moment, responding to needs he could perceive because of the gift the white serpent had given him: the ability to hear and understand the voices of creatures most people never noticed. The road eventually brought him to a kingdom far from the one he had left. It was different in superficial ways. The architecture showed different influences. The people dressed in different styles. The language carried different accents. But fundamentally, it was the same as any other place where humans gathered to build societies. There were rulers and ruled, wealthy and poor, those with power and those without. The attendant found work easily enough. Someone with his skills was always needed, and his quiet competence made him useful without making him memorable. But in this kingdom, there was a story being told. Everyone knew it, spoke of it, speculated about it. It concerned a woman who lived apart from the usual flow of social life, not quite in isolation, but in a state of careful separation. She was described in ways that varied depending on who was speaking. Beautiful, some said, though others insisted beauty was too simple a word for whatever quality she possessed. Wise, some claimed, though others said wisdom implied age, and she seemed outside the normal progression of years. Powerful. Many agreed, though her power seemed to come from some source other than wealth or position or force. What was consistent in all the stories was this: she had sworn that she would bind her life to no one who could not complete 3 trials. Not tests of strength, not demonstrations of wealth, not proofs of lineage or title. 3 trials that required something else entirely. Something the stories did not quite name, but implied had to do with understanding rather than domination, with harmony rather than conquest. Many had attempted the trials. All had failed. The failures were not dramatic. No one died. No one was humiliated or punished. They simply could not complete what was asked of them, and they left with the same quiet dignity with which they had arrived. The trials, it seemed, were not designed to be beaten, but to reveal whether one was the kind of person who belonged on the other side of them. The attendant heard these stories with interest, but not with immediate intention. He was not looking to bind his life to anyone. He had only recently freed himself from one set of obligations and did not feel ready to assume others. But he was curious in the way he had always been curious. And curiosity, combined with his new ability to hear what others could not, had a way of leading him into situations he had not planned for. He made inquiries, carefully, indirectly, in the manner of someone trying to understand rather than pursue. He learned that the woman lived in a dwelling on the outskirts of the kingdom, neither grand nor humble, but somewhere in between. She received visitors who wished to attempt the trials, but turned away those who came with the wrong intentions. How she discerned intention was unclear. Some speculated it was wisdom. Others claimed it was some form of sight beyond normal vision. The attendant suspected it might be something simpler. The ability to listen, truly listen, to what people said beneath their words. He found himself walking toward her dwelling one morning, when the spring rain was falling in that gentle, persistent way that makes everything glisten without drowning. He had not decided to attempt the trials. He had not decided anything. He was simply walking, following curiosity, allowing the path to unfold rather than forcing a direction upon it. The dwelling appeared as the stories had suggested. Well, maintained but not ostentatious, surrounded by gardens that showed attention without excessive cultivation. The woman herself stood in the doorway as he approached, as if she had been expecting him. She was not at all what he had anticipated, though he realized he had not actually formed clear expectations. Her face carried that quality of being simultaneously young and old, or perhaps neither, as if she existed in some relationship to time different from what most people experienced. "You have come about the trials," she said. It was not quite a question. "I have come," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "Whether about the trials, I'm not entirely certain." She studied him with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "You carry something unusual," she observed. "Not in your hands or your pack, but in how you stand in the world. You hear things." He met her gaze steadily. "I do. And yet you did not come seeking power or advantage. You came because you were curious?" "Wes," she smiled, and the expression transformed her face in a way that made her seem suddenly more human, more present. "Curiosity is rarer than most people imagine. Come inside. We should talk before you decide whether to attempt what others have failed." He followed her into the dwelling, and they sat across from each other at a table made from wood so old it had hardened into something almost like stone. She poured tea from a pot that steamed with fragrant vapor, and for a time they simply sat in comfortable silence, drinking and allowing the warmth to settle into their bones. "The trials," she said eventually, "are not what most people assume they are. They are not riddles to be solved through cleverness. They are not tests of strength or skill. They are revelations, situations that show whether a person is capable of existing in right relationship with the world." "And what does that mean?" he asked. "It means," she said slowly, choosing her words with visible care, "understanding that we are not separate from the world, but part of it. That power over others is less valuable than cooperation with them. That domination creates isolation, while harmony creates belonging. She paused, her eyes distant. Most people who come here want to prove themselves worthy through conquest. They want to master the trials, to beat them, to demonstrate superiority. Such people always fail because they have already misunderstood the fundamental question. What is the fundamental question? Whether you can listen, she said simply. Whether you can hear what the world is saying and respond with wisdom rather than force. He considered this. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the roof. From somewhere in the rafters, he could hear sparrows settling in for the day, speaking in low voices about the weather and food sources. Beneath the floorboards, mice moved in their secret highways, discussing matters of territory and family. The world was speaking constantly, as it always did, and he could hear all of it. I can listen, he said quietly. I don't know if I can respond with wisdom, but I can listen. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. Yes, she said. I believe you can. Very well. If you wish to attempt the trials, we will begin tomorrow. But understand this, if you succeed, you will be bound to me as I will be bound to you. Not as property, not as conquest, but as partnership. If that is not what you seek, it would be better not to begin. He thought about this through the evening and into the night, which he spent in a small room she offered him. He listened to the voices of the nocturnal world. Owls discussing hunting territories. Bats navigating through darkness. The slow conversations of trees exchanging nutrients through their root systems. And he thought about what kind of life he wanted, what kind of future he was walking toward. By morning, he had decided. Not with absolute certainty. He did not feel certain about anything, but with enough clarity to move forward. He would attempt the trials, not to prove anything, but to see what they would reveal, both about the world and about himself. The woman was waiting for him when he emerged into the early light. The first trial, she said, begins now. Follow me. She led him to a field beyond the gardens, where the ground was wet from the previous day's rain. In the center of the field stood a small pool of water, and in the center of that pool, barely visible above the surface, was a ring. Not the ruler's ring. That was a different story, a different time, but a ring nonetheless, precious and significant. You must retrieve the ring, she said, without disturbing the water. He looked at the pool. It was perhaps 10 paces across, the water still and reflective as a mirror. The ring sat on something just beneath the surface, a stone or piece of wood, impossible to determine from this distance. The instruction seemed impossible. To reach the ring, One would have to wade into the pool or reach across its surface. Either action would disturb the water. He stood at the edge of the pool and listened. The water itself had a voice, though it was not speech in any conventional sense. It was more like a sustained note, a vibration that carried information about depth and temperature and the life that moved within it. Beneath that, he could hear other voices: fish, insects, frogs, all the creatures that made the pool their home. He knelt at the edge and spoke, not out loud, but in the way he had learned to communicate with creatures who did not use human language. He explained his need to the fish who lived in the pool, describing the ring and asking if any of them could help. At first, there was no response. Fish are not particularly interested in human concerns. But gradually, one fish, larger than the others and apparently older, swam close to the surface. The fish regarded the ring with what might have been curiosity. Then, with a movement of its body that disturbed the water so slightly the ripples were barely visible, it nudged the ring with its nose. Once, twice. On the third nudge, the ring slid off whatever had been supporting it and began to sink. But the fish was there, catching it in its mouth before it could fall to the muddy bottom. The fish swam to the edge of the pool and released the ring into the attendant's outstretched hand. The water's surface trembled, but did not break. The ring passed from fish to human without the disturbance the trial had forbidden. The woman observed this with an expression that revealed nothing. "The second trial," she said, "is this way." She led him to a section of the garden where a plant grew, or rather, where a plant was dying. Its leaves were yellowed and spotted, its stem bent and weak. It looked like countless plants he had seen before, victims of disease or pest or simple neglect. "This plant," the woman said, "holds a seed that is needed. But to harvest the seed would kill the plant entirely, and I do not wish the plant to die. You must obtain the seed without causing the plant's death." He examined the plant carefully, looking at the damage, observing the pattern of decay. And as he looked, he listened. Plants do not speak in the way animals speak. Their communication is slower, more fundamental, conducted through chemical signals and root systems and the subtle language of growth and retreat. But he could sense the plant's distress, could understand what was afflicting it. Aphids. Hundreds of them. Too small to see easily, but collectively draining the plant's life force, feeding on its sap and weakening its ability to grow or produce seeds. The plant was not dying naturally. It was being killed. He searched the garden until he found what he needed: ladybugs. Dozens of them on other plants, going about their business of eating aphids. He spoke to them in the way he had learned to speak to small creatures, explaining that there was food available, Many aphids concentrated in one place, easy feeding for any who were interested. Ladybugs, it turned out, were very interested in easy food. They followed him back to the afflicted plant and set to work with the methodical efficiency of natural predators. Within hours, the aphids were gone. Within days, the plant began to recover, its leaves regaining their color, its stem straightening. And within a week, it produced seeds, not just one but several, which the woman harvested carefully before offering one to the attendant. "The third trial," she said, and her voice carried a different quality now, something that might have been respect or recognition, "is the most difficult because it requires you to understand something that cannot be directly observed." She led him to a locked chest, old and weathered, its wood dark with age. "Inside this chest," she said, "is an object that belongs to me, something precious that was lost long ago. I know it is in there because I placed it there myself before locking the chest and losing the key. You must tell me what the object is without opening the chest." He sat before the chest and listened. Wood has a voice, though it speaks slowly, recording the passage of years in the patterns of its grain. Metal has a voice, singing softly of the forces that shaped it. But the contents of a closed container do not speak to the outside world. They are held in isolation. Their voices trapped within the boundaries of their confinement. He could not hear what was inside. The direct approach would not work. So he listened to everything around the chest instead. He listened to the floor beneath it, to the air surrounding it, to the walls nearby. He listened for echoes and absences, for the ways the world had shaped itself around the presence of this object over the years. And gradually, a picture emerged, not complete, not perfectly clear, but enough. He heard the faint memories of spiders who had once woven webs in the corner near the chest, speaking of how the air moved differently near it, how there was a subtle warmth, even on cold days. He heard mice describing a sound the chest had once made. Not the wood itself, but something inside, something that rang very faintly when their movements caused vibrations in the floorboards. A bell, small, made of brass or bronze, designed to be worn or carried. Something that would warm slightly because metal held heat, differently than wood. Something that would ring, almost inaudibly when the world moved around it. "A bell," he said. "A small brass bell that you wore or carried. Something that meant enough to you that losing it felt like losing part of yourself." The woman's face remained composed, but something changed in her eyes. A brightness that might have been tears, or might have been something else entirely. Without speaking, she took a key from around her neck, a key he had not noticed she was wearing, and opened the chest. Inside, resting on fabric that had once been fine, but had aged to fragility, was a small brass bell. She lifted it carefully, and it made a sound so soft it was barely audible, a voice speaking from years of silence. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to keep it safe. To remember that small voices matter as much as large ones. I locked it away for protection, and then lost the key. Lost the ability to reach what I had tried so hard to preserve." She looked at him with an expression that held multiple meanings simultaneously. "You did not open the chest, but you understood what it held. Not through force, not through cleverness, but through listening to what the world was willing to tell you." She set the bell down gently and turned to face him fully. "You have completed the 3 trials. Not because you are strong or clever or powerful, but because you understand something most people never learn. That we are part of a world that is constantly communicating, constantly offering knowledge to those who can hear. That power over things is less valuable than relationship with them. That every voice, no matter how small, carries meaning." She paused, and the silence that followed was comfortable, spacious, full of unspoken understanding. "I swore I would bind my life to anyone who could complete these trials. Are you willing to accept that binding? Not as master or servant, not as owner or owned, but as equals who have chosen to walk the same path." He thought about this, about what it would mean. The trials had not been tests of his ability, but revelations of who he had become since tasting the white serpent's flesh. They had shown him that the gift he had received was not power over the world, but the ability to exist in harmony with it, to hear its voices and respond with understanding rather than domination. "I am willing," he said. And so they were joined, not through ceremony or ritual, but through mutual recognition. They had both been changed by their journeys. Hers longer than his, her trials different, but ultimately teaching the same lessons. They understood that they were not separate from the world, but woven into it, that their lives were part of a larger pattern that included every creature, every voice, every intention from the smallest insect to the widest sky. Time passed. They built a life together, not in the sense of creating something entirely new, but in the sense of discovering what had always been there, waiting for them to find it. They tended the gardens together, listening to what the plants needed, responding to the subtle communications of soil and root and leaf. They helped travelers who passed through, not with grand gestures, but with small kindnesses. A meal shared, a direction given, a wound tended. They lived quietly, their existence barely noticed by the larger world. But those whose they touched carried something away with them, even if they could not name what it was. The attendant, though he was no longer an attendant, no longer defined by service to a ruler he did not know, sometimes thought about the white serpent. He thought about that moment in the silent hall when he had lifted the silver lid and tasted something that changed everything. He had not sought that change. He had not known what he was reaching for. But in tasting the serpent's flesh, he had received a gift that could not be undone, a transformation that could not be reversed. The gift was not power. That was what others might have assumed, what he himself might have expected. The ability to hear the voices of creatures, to understand their communications, and learn their secrets. This could have been used for advantage, for manipulation, for gaining power over others. But that was not what the white serpent had offered. Instead, it had given him the ability to exist in alignment with the world, to move through it not as a conqueror, but as a participant, to understand that every voice mattered and every life was connected to his own. He did not feel powerful. He felt instead profoundly aware of his place in a pattern so large it included everything. Every breath of wind, every drop of rain, every movement of every creature across the face of the earth. The pattern was not imposed but emergent, arising from the countless interactions of countless beings, all existing together in the same shared world. And he was part of it, no more important than a beetle, but no less important either. Each playing their role in the great conversation that never ended. Sometimes, in the evening, when the work of the day was done, he and the woman would sit in the garden and listen to the world speaking. They did not need to talk much between themselves. They had learned each other's rhythms, each other's meanings, the way partners do when they have truly heard each other. They would sit in comfortable silence while around them the voices of the world rose and fell, speaking of weather and season, of territory and family, of the ancient patterns that connected all living things. The birds spoke of migration routes they would follow when autumn came. The insects spoke of the slow chemistry of decay and renewal. The earthworms spoke of tunnels and darkness and the rich complexity of soil. The trees spoke in their patient way about sunlight and water and the slow accumulation of years. And through it all, beneath it all, the earth itself hummed with a voice so deep it was felt more than heard. A vibration that carried the weight of everything that had ever lived or would ever live. He thought sometimes about the people in the great stone residence where he had once carried the silver dish. He wondered if they ever understood what had happened, if they had found someone else to perform that silent duty, if the ruler still ate alone each evening in that vast empty hall. He held no bitterness toward them. They had been part of his journey, a necessary chapter in the story that had brought him here. Without that life, Without those years of quiet service and careful observation, he might not have been ready to receive what the white serpent offered, because the gift required readiness. It required the ability to notice what others overlooked, to value what others dismissed, to listen when others were too busy speaking. These were skills he had learned in his years of invisibility, his years of being the person no one quite saw. He had learned to observe without being observed, to understand without being understood. And when the white serpent's gift opened his ears to the voices beneath the world, he had already developed the capacity to truly hear them. He thought about the trials, about how each one had required not domination, but cooperation, not force, but understanding. The fish had helped him not because he commanded it, but because he asked. The ladybugs had come not because he controlled them, but because he offered them something they wanted. The chest's secret had been revealed not through breaking it open, but through listening to everything it had touched over the years. In each case, success had come through harmony rather than conquest, through relationship rather than power. This was what the white serpent had really given him. Not the ability to control the world's creatures, but the ability to exist in right relationship with them. And that, he had come to understand, was a far more profound gift than power could ever be. Power created separation, established hierarchies, built walls between the powerful and everything else. But relationship created connection, established mutuality, built bridges that allowed all things to exist together in the same pattern. The seasons turned, as seasons do. Spring became summer, became autumn, became winter, became spring again. The garden grew and rested and grew again. Travelers came and went, each carrying their own stories, their own questions, their own journeys toward understanding. Some stayed for a while, learning what they needed to learn before moving on. Others passed through quickly, touching the edges of the life he and the woman had built, but not quite entering it. All were welcome. All were treated with the same quiet respect, the same careful attention. Years accumulated, though he found it hard to track them precisely. Time felt different now, less like a straight line moving from past to future and more like a river that flowed in multiple directions simultaneously, carrying everything along in its current. He aged, as all things age, but the aging felt less like decline and more like deepening, as if he were becoming more fully himself with each passing season. The woman aged too, or perhaps she didn't. It was hard to tell with her. Sometimes she seemed young, vital, full of immediate presence. Other times she seemed ancient, carrying the weight of centuries in her eyes. He suspected she existed in some relationship to time that he did not fully understand, but he did not press her to explain. Everyone carried mysteries, even those we knew most intimately. Especially those we knew most intimately. What mattered was not explanation but experience. They lived together in the pattern they had woven. A pattern that included the garden and the dwelling, and the creatures who shared their space, and the travelers who passed through, and the seasons that kept turning, and the earth that held them all. It was not a perfect life. Nothing is perfect when it involves actual living rather than abstract ideals. There were difficulties and disagreements, moments of confusion and frustration, times when the world felt overwhelming in its complexity. But through it all, they remained in relationship. With each other, with the world, with the voices that never stopped speaking. And that relationship, that fundamental connection to the living pattern of existence, carried them through whatever challenges arose. One evening, many years after the trials, they sat in the garden as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet. The air was warm with the remnants of summer, though autumn was beginning to make itself known in the subtle shortening of days. Birds were settling into their roosts, speaking in sleepy voices about the day's activities. Insects were emerging for their nocturnal work, discussing the cooling air and the moisture gathering in the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a fox was explaining to her kits how to hunt mice in the growing darkness. The woman turned to him with an expression that held both amusement and seriousness. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, tasting the white serpent, receiving the gift, leaving your old life behind. He considered the question carefully, as he considered all questions, not rushing to answer, but letting the inquiry settle into his mind, exploring its dimensions, understanding what was really being asked. "No," he said finally, "not regret. Sometimes I feel the weight of it. The responsibility that comes with hearing what others cannot hear, knowing what others do not know. But regret implies wishing things were different, wishing I could return to who I was before. And I don't wish that. I cannot even imagine it anymore. It would be like a bird wishing it could return to being an egg." She nodded, as if this was the answer she had expected. "The white serpent's gift is irreversible," she said. "Once given, it cannot be taken back. You are changed permanently, fundamentally. But change is not the same as damage. You have not been broken, but transformed." "Yes," he agreed. "Transformed. That's the right word." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the evening speaking to itself. The light faded gradually, not disappearing, but shifting into different frequencies, making way for the moon and stars to offer their own illumination. The garden settled into its nocturnal rhythms, one set of voices quieting as another set emerged. "The thing about the white serpent," the woman said eventually, is that it only offers its gift to those who are ready to receive it, not worthy. Readiness and worthiness are different things, but ready, capable of hearing what it offers. Most people could taste the white serpent's flesh and feel nothing, learn nothing, change nothing. It takes a particular kind of awareness, a particular capacity for attention, to receive what it gives. I didn't feel ready, he said. I felt curious. That's all. Curiosity is a form of readiness, she replied. It's the willingness to encounter the world as it is rather than as we expect it to be. Most people are too certain to be curious. They already know what they think they need to know. And so they miss what's actually being offered. He thought about this, about the young man he had been in that moment when he lifted the silver lid. He had not been certain about anything. He had simply wanted to see, to know, to understand. That curiosity had opened a door. And on the other side of that door was a world that had always been speaking, always been offering knowledge, always been waiting for someone to listen. The gift, he said slowly, is not just the ability to hear. It's the responsibility to listen, to pay attention, to act on what we learn with wisdom rather than advantage. Yes, she said. Exactly yes. The white serpent tests nothing except whether we are the kind of people who will use knowledge for harmony rather than control. And you passed that test, not in the moment you tasted the flesh, but in every moment afterward. In every choice you made about how to live with what you had learned. The stars were visible now, scattered across the darkening sky like seeds planted in the field of night. Each one was a sun, he knew, impossibly distant, but nonetheless real, each one offering light to worlds he would never see. The pattern was so vast it exceeded comprehension, yet he was part of it, connected to those distant fires by the same fundamental forces that connected him to the beetles in the garden and the fish in the pool and the woman sitting beside him. I wonder, he said, what became of the white serpent, where it came from, why the ruler ate it every night, whether there were others who tasted it before me, or if I was the first. Those are questions, she replied, that we may never be able to answer. The white serpent's origins are lost in time, older than kingdoms, older perhaps than human language itself. But I suspect you were not the first to receive its gift. Throughout history, there have been people who could speak with animals, who understood the language of birds and the wisdom of trees. We call them shamans or wise ones or saints. But perhaps they were simply people like you. People who tasted the white serpent and learned to listen. He found this thought comforting. The idea that he was not alone, that there had been others throughout time who had walked the same path, who had heard the same voices, who had struggled with the same responsibility. They formed a pattern too, stretched across centuries, connected not by proximity, but by shared understanding. The night deepened. The voices around them shifted and evolved, the constant conversation of existence continuing without pause. They would eventually go inside, prepare for sleep, rest their bodies for whatever the next day would bring. But for now, they sat in the garden and listened. To people who recognize yourself, who had learned to hear what the world was saying, and who had chosen to respond with harmony rather than force, with understanding rather than domination, with love rather than power. The white serpent's gift was not magic, not in the way stories usually describe magic. It was simpler and more profound than that. It was the ability to recognize that we are not separate from the world, but part of it, that every voice matters, that every life is connected to every other life in a pattern so intricate and beautiful it could only be called sacred. And in that recognition, in that fundamental shift of perception, lay a peace that no amount of power or wealth or status could ever provide. Because power separates us from the world, but harmony connects us to it. And connection, he had learned, was what he had been seeking all along, even before he knew he was seeking anything. The moon rose higher, casting its silver light across the garden. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. In the soil beneath their feet, earthworms continued their ancient work. In the sky above, stars wheeled through their slow dance, and everywhere, in every direction, the world spoke its truths to anyone willing to listen. He had been a young attendant once, invisible and overlooked, carrying a silver dish through silent corridors. He had tasted something he was not meant to taste, and been transformed in ways he could not have imagined. He had left everything familiar and walked into the unknown. He had learned to listen, truly listen, to what the world was saying. He had completed trials that revealed not his power, but his capacity for harmony. And he had found, in all of this, a life that felt true, in a way nothing before it had ever felt true. This was the gift of the white serpent. Not dominion over the world, but partnership with it. Not power over others, but relationship with them. Not certainty, but continuous learning, continuous listening, continuous adjustment to the great conversation that never ends. And as he sat in the garden with the woman who had become his partner, listening to the voices of night, speaking their ancient wisdom, he felt something that might have been gratitude, or might have been joy, or might have been something simpler and more fundamental than either. The basic satisfaction of being in the right place, doing the right work, living the right life. The white serpent had not made him powerful. It had made him aligned. And alignment, he had discovered, was worth more than all the power in the world. The story of the white serpent continues as all true stories continue in the lives of those who learn to listen, who choose harmony over domination, who understand that we are not separate from the world, but woven into its very fabric. It continues in every small act of kindness toward creatures we might otherwise overlook, in every moment of true listening, in every choice to cooperate rather than conquer. And somewhere, perhaps, in a silent hall in a stone residence, another young attendant carries a silver dish toward a ruler who eats alone. Perhaps tonight will be the night when curiosity overcomes caution. Perhaps tonight a new chapter will begin. Perhaps the white serpent's gift will be offered again, to someone ready to receive it, to someone willing to be transformed. The pattern continues, endlessly renewing itself, endlessly offering the same fundamental truth, that we are all connected, all part of the same vast conversation, all worthy of being heard and capable of hearing. All we need do is listen.